Now I work for the Congressional Research Service, which is one of 3 legislative branch agencies, and it's a very interesting place to work. Just keep that in mind for the future. My presentation today is going to focus more on the nitty-gritty of Social Security. Don't worry, you can handle it, even the technical stuff, because you're going to need to when you do your own solvency plans later on today. So I want you to have a good foundation in how the program works as it is now. I'm going to talk a little bit about benefits, a bit about taxes, and then a little bit about how the trust funds work, although you're lucky enough to have the Chief Actuary of Social Security, Steve Goss, speaking later on, and he's going to tell you more about the solvency situation of Social Security, so don't worry, that part is coming. So let's move on. Oh, thank you very much. Oh, sorry. There are, how many beneficiaries are there? Well, 51 million people. That's 1 in 6 Americans. So many, many people are touched by Social Security. And it's very, very likely that every single one of you at some point will be receiving benefits as well. Who's getting these benefits today? Well, as Kilolo pointed out, Social Security is not just a retirement program. Only about 2/3 of beneficiaries are retired workers and their families. The remaining 1/3 are survivors of deceased workers and disabled workers and their families. So that's important to keep in mind. How does the benefit formula work? Well, in a nutshell, higher earners receive larger benefits because benefits are based on earnings. So the more money you've earned, the higher the dollar amount of your benefit will be. And I have some examples here, just using hypothetical workers. However, lower earners receive higher replacement rates. And a replacement rate means the proportion of your pre-retirement earnings that is replaced by your Social Security benefit. So that's because the Social Security benefit formula is progressive. And so you get more money back on the sort of lower portion of your earnings, and the higher up you go, the less money back you get. It's sort of the opposite of the progressive income tax structure, where you pay a little bit more on each additional dollar that you earn. Now, how does this work exactly? It's that's one part of the benefit formula. The other part is, as I mentioned, your wages. And the way that Social Security calculates your income over your lifetime is by taking every single year and indexing it to wages. This is a little bit technical, but very, very important, because one of the things that, for example, the Bush administration was talking about was something called price indexing. And so you need to know the difference between what's wage indexing, what's price indexing. So what it means is when Social Security takes all those earnings, they use what's called the average wage index, and taking that first year's earnings. So say it's back in like 1970 or whatever, you're earning $6,000 or whatever they were earning back then. They need to make that equivalent to to today's earnings, so that it's, someone at an equivalent job today, what would they be earning? And so that's how that works when they index your wages. And basically by doing, that's sort of a little bit non-technical explanation, obviously, but by doing that, they allow beneficiaries to share in rising living standards. And that's very, very important, because as things change, today we have many more medical advances, for example, than existed in 1970 or 1935 when the program was created. We have things like cars and seat belts and airbags and things that we are just sort of considered standard. And so as those living standards rise, people want to be able to take advantage of all those things in their retirement, just as they did in their working years. So that's sort of the idea behind wage indexing. Now, that's in year 1. Your benefits are wage indexed. After that first year, benefits are indexed to prices, otherwise known as inflation. And that's where the annual cost of living adjustment comes in. And that cost of living adjustment allows benefits to maintain purchasing power over time, which is not the same thing as maintaining or increasing with rising living standards. That's just being able to afford the same things that you could afford in year 1. The benefit formula is subject to certain adjustments. One of those is the age at which you retire. So if you retire early, you get a permanent reduction in your benefits. If you retire later, up to age 70, you get a permanent credit in your benefits. So it's to your advantage often to wait to collect those retirement benefits as long as you can. Another adjustment that's made to benefits is if you have earnings before what's known as the full retirement age, and we'll get more into that later, your benefits are reduced. full retirement age is increasing. So for pretty much everyone in this room, your full retirement age will be 67. Today, for current retirees, it's 66, but for most of the program's history, it was 65. This is a very gradual policy change that was made back in 1983 when last Congress decided to deal with the issue of Social Security solvency. And the increase in the full retirement age didn't even begin until 2000, many years after 1983. And it's being implemented very, very gradually. And so that's another thing you might want to keep in mind as you do your plans, that these things are often put off into the future so that people have some time to adjust and then implemented very gradually. So think about that as you design your policy changes. This change effectively reduces benefits for all retired workers. That's something that's important to know. Sometimes people don't really know how to categorize a change like this, but that's what it does. It's a benefit cut. In addition to benefits for workers based on their earnings, workers' families also get benefits. And those family members include spouses, as well as former spouses, as long as the marriage was at least 10 years, children, and in very rare cases, dependent parents. These family benefits are based on the worker's benefit amount, different percentages for different people. So for example, a stay-at-home parent upon retirement could get a benefit of up to 50% of, say, her husband's benefit at retirement if she didn't have an earnings history of her own. And a child, if her father dies, for example, could get a benefit equal to 75% of his benefit while she is still under 18, or up to 18. Social Security, where does this fit into the bigger picture? Well, basically, it's a very, very important income source for the elderly, as well as for other groups, as we talked about. And about 2/5 of elderly income comes from Social Security. So for your average person, it's quite an important source of income. However, this varies widely by income level. And so for the poorest 20% of the elderly get 4/5, more than 80% of their income from Social Security. It's extraordinarily important to them. For the highest 20% of income earners among the elderly, it's about 1/5, and so it's a less important source of income for that group. This is another thing you want to keep in mind when you're making your plans, thinking about, well, a cut to a lower income person is going to hurt much, much more than, say, a cut to a higher income person. Now, let's get a little bit more into the tax side of the equation, which is something you're also going to be looking at. Who pays into Social Security? Well, you do. Every worker, almost every worker, 94% of workers are covered by Social Security, which means that they contribute to the system through their taxes. That's 164 million Americans. How much do you pay? Well, it's 12.4% of your earnings divided between employees and employers. So that means 6.2% of your earnings are coming out of every paycheck. That goes up to $106,800 in 2009. Now, I'm sure some of you are earning a lot more than that at your internships. And so, but you don't pay on the earnings that you have above 106,000. So Bill Gates is paying the same amount as someone who's earning, say, 110,000, the same number of dollars. That's how that works. It's capped. And that's something that some people have discussed changing in potential solvency plans. How much money is Social Security taking in right now? Well, in 2008, it was about $805 billion. Most of that was those taxes we talked about, the payroll taxes. And then there's some interest, which we'll get into a little bit more later, and a little bit of taxation of benefits. So remember that 805 when we're looking at the next slide. How much does Social Security spend? $625 billion in 2008. So Social Security is doing pretty well right now. It has a surplus, a significant surplus for this year, but that's not going to last forever. As you can see, about 99% of Social Security spending goes toward benefits. Only about 1% goes towards administrative expenses. So it's an extraordinarily efficient program, especially when you consider that the agency employs more than 60,000 people, and that's all in that little 1% slice of the pie. Oh, and just a word about SSI, since this is on this chart. The Social Security Administration administers both Social Security benefits and supplemental security income benefits, and those SSI benefits are low-income benefits for very, very low income and low asset individuals, means tested benefits. And as you know, at the National Academy of Social Insurance, Social Security benefits are social insurance benefits based on your earnings that are available to everyone regardless of income level. That's an important distinction. Actually, you would be surprised at the number of congressional staffers who don't know the difference. So you're smarter than a lot of them already. Now, just a couple words about the trust funds and how they work. As I mentioned, you're very lucky to have Steve Goss to explain in much more detail about how they work and what the projections are, but just a little bit about the mechanics. In surplus years, like this year, surplus funds are invested in special issue treasury bonds. Now, there's a lot of debate about what does this mean, but it's actually not that difficult. You know, President Bush was photographed with a file cabinet that he said was full of worthless IOUs, and other people say, hey, these are government bonds backed by the full faith and credit of the U.S. government. Well, in some sense, both are true. Bonds, just like the savings bonds you buy, are IOUs. I would argue that they're not worthless IOUs, but they are IOUs. You're lending the government money, just as you lend the bank money when you go make a deposit in your savings account. The bank doesn't go and put it in a little vault with your name engraved on it. The bank goes and loans that to someone to make a mortgage or to lend a small business some money. And when you go to get that money back, then hopefully you get a little bit of interest, maybe, maybe not. Same thing, it works for savings bonds, and exactly the same thing for these special issue bonds for Social Security. So the U.S. Treasury does borrow those funds, uses it for other spending, for tax reductions, and for debt repayment. And when those bonds come due, the Treasury must repay them to the Social Security trust funds with interest. Now, how does this work in deficit years? Well, when those bonds come due, as I mentioned, they are redeemed and repaid with interest. In other words, those funds have to be transferred from the Treasury back to the Social Security trust funds. And that means just the opposite of what it meant during the borrowing years, reducing spending, increasing taxes, or borrowing. And I put a little asterisk by borrowing because all borrowing is reducing spending or increasing taxes down the road. You're just kicking the can down the road. So this is a really important thing, that these deficit years are coming very quickly, and when they happen, it's going to have a big impact on the federal budget. So I have just one final slide just for your reference, but we're not going to go over it, which is the basic Social Security benefit formula. So when you're going over things, then you know what but I didn't want to bore you with with all of the details. But I hope that what you take from this is that though Social Security is complicated, it's certainly something that you can master and later today manipulate, and so that you can come up with a solvent system for your future and mine. Thank you very much.